So what I want to try to do, I really hope to make this interactive as quickly as possible, because I just like it better when it's a discussion. But I wanted to talk a little bit about this institution of the first 100 days. It actually doesn't originate with Franklin Roosevelt. It originates with Napoleon. And if you were a well-educated person in the 19th or early 20th century and somebody said, what were the 100 days? You would say that was the famous 100 days was the period between the time in 1815 when Napoleon returned from exile on the Isle of Elba. Remember that palindrome, able were I ere I saw Elba, spelled backward, the same forward and backwards. He was in exile, and he returned to France in triumph. But then a mere 100 days later, he was defeated by Wellington at the Battle of Waterloo and was finished. And so that was what was known as the 100 days, the real short period of Napoleon's comeback. So then, fast forward to 1933, and I want to just talk for a few minutes about what the country was like in 1933. Some of it might sound kind of familiar, but it was a lot worse. When Franklin Roosevelt took office, in those days the inauguration was on March 4th, not on January 20th, unemployment was 25%. The stock market, instead of being down 30–40%, was down 90%. People felt like capitalism and democracy were on the line, and maybe they were done. The word dictator had a positive connotation. Studebaker had a car called the Dictator that sold fairly well in this period. Newspapers ran big editorials, wanted a dictator. The great pundit of the time, when pundits actually had some power, Walter Lippmann, went to Franklin Roosevelt on the eve of the inauguration and said, Franklin, you may have to assume dictatorial powers. The Roosevelt Library, where I did a lot of work, I found a document that had never surfaced before because it was in the sort of category of what ifs, which most historians are not as interested in, or maybe sometimes there's so many documents here at the Clinton Library or Hyde Park, the Roosevelt Library, any of the presidential libraries, you can always find new material. I remember when I started my FDR book, James McGregor Burns, great historian, Williams College, said, you'll find new stuff, don't worry, you'll always find new stuff. And I found a document from the first day of the Roosevelt presidency, the day after the famous, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, inaugural address. And it's a speech to the American Legion on the radio. And in this draft that I found, Roosevelt says, as Commander-in-Chief, I hereby reserve to myself the right to command you in any phase of the conflict. Now, these were guys in their 30s who were World War I veterans. He had zero constitutional authority to command them in anything. But in this draft, it has him creating a private army like Mussolini's. Mussolini was very popular, not just in Italy, but in the United States at this time. And Hitler was brand new, came in the same weekend as FDR, so people didn't know how bad he was yet. Roosevelt doesn't give the speech. And I still don't know, there's no name on it, so I don't know which one of his aides or speechwriters wrote it. But instead he gives a very ordinary, unnewsworthy restatement of his inaugural address of the day before. And I think that's why nobody had noticed this before. But it tells you how close we actually came to the assumption of dictatorial powers. And Roosevelt, to his great credit, chose instead to substitute his powers of persuasion and his leadership abilities to lift up the country and not have to resort to coercion or extra-constitutional authority. The banks were already closed. 3/5 of them were already closed at the time Roosevelt took office. The bank closures had started because of the dysfunctional relationship between Henry Ford and Edsel Ford in Michigan. Edsel Ford had owned a bank that went bust. Henry wouldn't bail out the bank. Michigan had to close its banks. They then couldn't lend to other banks. Pretty soon, most of the banks were closed. And on the morning, on the eve of the inauguration, Hoover, the outgoing president, Herbert Hoover, and Franklin Roosevelt are screaming at each other over the banks. If you don't, Roosevelt says, if you won't close them, I will. And he storms out of there. And when Eleanor told reporters about this back at the Mayflower Hotel, they didn't print it because they were worried that it would be even worse for the United States and would create even more panic and maybe even revolution if the world knew that the outgoing and incoming president had been yelling at each other. So it was high drama. Then the next day at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning, the governors of Illinois and New York closed their banks. And then the few banks that are remaining open, Roosevelt, in one of his first acts, he closes the rest of them. Now, in some ways, that made it much easier than the situation we have today because the government could then decide which banks were healthy enough to reopen, to allow to be reopened. It was a much cleaner way of dealing with the banking crisis than President Obama and Treasury Secretary Geithner and Larry Summers, who was Treasury Secretary under Clinton and is now head of the National Economic Council. In some ways, a much less complicated task at the bottom of the Depression because they could just leave the closed banks closed instead of having to figure out how to prop up these banks as is going on today. But it was terrifying. People didn't know whether capitalism was done or not. The head of the Harvard Business School thought capitalism might be over, and a lot of people thought democracy might be over. The head of President of Columbia University, who just won the Nobel Peace Prize, said he thought that maybe elections weren't the best way to run a country. A visitor came to see FDR early on and said, Mr. President, if you succeed, you'll be our greatest president. If you fail, you'll be our worst president. And he said, no, if I fail, I'll be our last president. And he wasn't joking. So as bad as we think things are now, as rough as it is for a lot of people, it was a lot rougher then. But what Roosevelt did was to break sharply with the past, and Obama has done something very similar, and part of it is philosophical. Herbert Hoover and George W. Bush believed that if your home was about to be foreclosed upon, it was basically your problem. Franklin Roosevelt and Barack Obama take a different view philosophically. But most of it is not ideological and philosophical. It's about a spirit of pragmatism and flexibility that Roosevelt, and I think now arguably Obama, are bringing to Washington. So first thing Roosevelt does in his first 100 days is to close the rest of the banks, have a bank holiday, as he festively called it. It sounded better. Tried to lift people's spirits right away. When he said the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, that was actually a bit of inspired nonsense when you think about it. If you're worried about how to put a roof over your head or food on the table, that's something real. That's not just fear itself. And yet it worked. It was what the novelists call the willing suspension of disbelief. People started to feel that they could be better. So after closing the banks, then he goes on the radio in the first of his famous fireside chats. Usually he had a false tooth that had been knocked out when he was a child, and he'd usually forget to put his fake tooth in until right before airtime. Then an aide would to run up to his family quarters and bring it down in a little jewelry box, and he'd be screwing it into his mouth right before air so that he didn't whistle on the air. And he said, my friends, he'd start out, my friends. I hadn't heard that since Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar, when he has Mark Antony saying, my friends, Romans, countrymen. I want to speak to you tonight for a few moments about banking. And he had been looking out at the scaffolding from his inaugural being taken down by workmen, and he said to himself, I'm going to write a speech about banking that workman can understand. And so the same, after they listened to him on the radio, and he said, hoarding has become a terribly unfashionable pastime. Please take your money out from under the mattress and redeposit it in our banks as they reopen under my plan. And so the same people who had been pushing each other out of the way to get to the front of the window in their bank in these terrifying bank runs a couple of weeks earlier. And then, you'd see it in the movies, the shade would be pulled down, banks closed, trying to get their money out, couldn't get it out. Some of them could get it out and put it under their mattress. The same people the next week are lining up to patriotically redeposit their money after listening to the president. Now that's leadership, if you can manage to convince people to do that. And that stabilized the banking system and the plan, the bank rescue plan, which was actually designed under Herbert Hoover's Treasury Department. It wasn't a liberal plan. The New Dealers, the liberals, came to FDR and said, you've got to nationalize the banks, just like today, right? The whole debate over nationalizing the banks. Liberals want to nationalize the banks today. Roosevelt said, no, we're going to keep banking in private hands. He said, fallback position was, let's let the post office run the banks. That would have been cute, huh? Over the course of the 20th century, the post office ran our banking system. That's the way it works in some other countries. And Roosevelt said, no, and some things he did in those first 100 days were quite conservative. He cut government spending by 31%. Now, is it mostly cutting veterans' benefits in half? Now, in retrospect, that was the wrong thing to do, because the last thing you want to do in a recession or depression is cut spending. But through a series of other things he did, over time, they cut unemployment from 25% down to just below 10%. There's been some real misreporting on all this, which we can talk about if you want. And then, in order to run up a big victory in 1936, Roosevelt cut spending to try to balance the budget, and that sent unemployment back up to 17% because he cut back. Then, when World War II was breaking out in Europe, they had massive government spending in the United States to get ready for war, and that's when we finally came out of the Great Depression. So it was some years, and it took a lot of spending. So when you hear people say, well, we need a budget freeze now, or we can't be spending right now, this is just nonsense. And conservative economists like Martin Feldstein, who was Ronald Reagan's economic advisor, they agree. When you're in, obviously you need fiscal responsibility in the medium term and the long term, but in the short term, when you're in a recession, you must spend. It's the Keynesian approach is the only way out, government spending. So Roosevelt did that in kind of fits and starts, and he moved left and right at the same time. And he had 15 major pieces of legislation during this special session of Congress. They had the first farm price supports ever in the Agricultural Adjustment Act, pretty important here in Arkansas. Farming was half the economy, and they stabilized the farm economy and raised prices. The first regulation of Wall Street, the Securities Act of 1933, didn't become, often they were down payments on changes to come later on. The SEC wasn't created until the following year. Social Security was 2 years later. The most important to my mind, the best of Roosevelt's first 100-day programs was the Civilian Conservation Corps, Roosevelt's Tree Army, it was called. And this was another sign of his brilliant leadership. He said, I want 250,000 young men, many of them hobos, out in the forests, in the woods, planting trees, clearing trails, doing soil conservation. And it happened. In 3 months, by summer, they had 250,000 young people, which ironically is the same size precisely that Bill Clinton's AmeriCorps just last week was expanded. CCC was the first national service program. Now, last week, we had Serve America Act, Ted Kennedy's Serve America Act, which built on AmeriCorps and expanded it from 75,000 to 250,000, which was the original number. Eventually, 3 million young men planted 3 billion trees. 3 billion trees, arguably saved the topography of the United States and became the template for all the other jobs programs, the WPA and the others that Roosevelt put into place. Some of the ideas in the first 100 days were not good. The National Industrial Recovery Act was the centerpiece of Roosevelt's program, even though it was a kind of a broken play that was done in response to some things that had happened on Capitol Hill. This was the total regulation of everything in the American economy. Some of you might remember seeing a blue eagle. That was the insignia of the National Recovery Act. In those days, NRA stood for National Recovery Administration. Changed a little bit. And it said, we do our part. And it was a great morale booster because everybody felt like they were working against the Depression. But to have massive price fixing and restraint of trade, turning the entire American economy into a big cartel was a terrible idea. And I like to use just one example to show how bad an idea it was. That Washington bureaucrats actually regulated the burlesque industry, and they told striptease owners, strip club owners, how many times a night their strippers could take off their clothes. There was a code, you know, in bureaucratic language, strippers can only take off their clothes a certain number of times a night from Washington. So things went a little crazy, and eventually the Supreme Court fortunately declared it unconstitutional. That's contrary to what you'll hear from some liberal historians who think everything that FDR did was great. No, that's not true. He made a lot of mistakes. Later on, the court packing scheme, big mistake. Internment of the Japanese, obviously big mistake during World War II. But at the end of the special session of Congress in June of 1933, in July actually, I was looking back at June, Roosevelt, who was a student of European history, and he knew something about Napoleon, he noticed that the special session of Congress had lasted exactly 100 days. And he gave a speech saying, we accomplished a lot in our first 100 days, 15 major pieces of legislation. I didn't even mention many of them on, easing foreclosures and a lot of other things that would sound familiar to modern ears. And that became a real burden for all subsequent presidents because there was a book that a wonderful historian named William Leuchtenberg wrote called In the Shadow of FDR. Basically, nobody could measure up. Bill Clinton was the first Democrat elected to 2 terms since FDR. That's how long the Democrats were trying to measure up. They couldn't do it. And all of them labored under this idea of the first 100 days. Kennedy, in particular, resented it. And in his inaugural address, he said, our goals will not be met in the first 100 days or the first 1,000 days, that became the name of Arthur Schlesinger's famous memoir, or even in our lifetime on this planet. He was really trying to give himself a lot of time to achieve his objectives. And indeed, he had a horrible first 100 days, probably the worst of any modern president. That was when the Bay of Pigs fiasco happened, when they attacked Cuba with a tiny band of outgunned Cuban exiles who were quickly defeated by the Cubans. JFK actually cried over this and described himself as humiliated, and he said it was the worst experience of his entire life. And remember, he had been marooned in the South Pacific and almost died, so it was pretty bad for him. But by admitting some error, his popularity skyrocketed. So it's very interesting when things go bad for presidents, and we saw this with President Clinton as well, if they admit some mistakes and they show some humility and some acknowledgement of error, the people are usually with them. And actually, Kennedy's popularity in his first 100 days, even though he got nothing through Congress, nothing accomplished, foreign policy fiasco, were higher even than Obama's are today, because he admitted that he had messed up at the Bay of Pigs. Johnson had a tremendously productive first 100 days in 1965. Now, it's kind of an apples and oranges comparison, because he had become president, of course, on Kennedy's assassination, November 22nd, 1963. And then in 1964, almost as a memorial to the slain president, they got the Civil Rights Act of 1964 through, and some other things. But the early part of 1965, stretching just a little bit beyond the first 100 days, was, I would argue, the most fertile legislative period in American history. You had the Voting Rights Act of 1965, critically important piece of legislation, which changed the country. You had the first aid to education, federal aid to education. You had the establishment of Medicare and Medicaid. Think about what that's done to change the country. Then a bill that nobody remembers at all, the Immigration Act of 1965. For the first time, it let non-Europeans into this country in any numbers, changed the face of America. The war on poverty that created a whole series of poverty-fighting programs. That was all done by Lyndon Johnson in 1965, and of course it was greatly overshadowed by what happened to him in Vietnam. And it was in that same 100-day period, actually, that he began the escalation in Vietnam, which is what I wrote my thesis about in college. So that 1965 period was very, very important. The Republicans were less concerned about the first 100 days, but the press was already using it as a kind of a crutch. So Nixon tried to tamp down expectations. His accomplishments in 1969 were mostly related to going along with the Democratic Congress when they wanted to do certain things. So not necessarily in the first 100 days, but in that early period, you had the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, OSHA, other things that were part of Nixon's early years. Then, to jump ahead to Jimmy Carter, he really did not get a lot done in his first 100 days because he sort of stumbled and he ticked off Congress. He didn't give Tip O'Neill the seats that he wanted for the inauguration. Tip O'Neill was the Speaker of the House. That wasn't real smart. He canceled a bunch of water projects that members of Congress, today we'd call them earmarks, then they called it pork, that members of Congress wanted. And Carter was right about it, but this was really dumb. I mean, these guys were, they had been in charge since the early 50s, these old bulls on Capitol Hill, and they weren't going to do anything for this peanut farmer that happened to stumble into the presidency. And so they just, stopped him cold, and his presidency arguably never really recovered from his inability to work with a Congress from the same party at the outset of his presidency. Ronald Reagan had a quite successful first 100 days, but it was mostly because he was shot. His original, it's true, I mean, I could tell a story that relates to a conversation that I had with a later president, but I can't remember about this subject, but I can't remember if it was on or off the record, so I'm going to not tell it. I'm sorry to tell you. We have to be careful that way. If we print things that are off, if we say them, everybody's now twittering, and it'll be on the internet in 5 minutes, and I'll really be in trouble. So I shouldn't have said anything. But basically, I did have a discussion with a later president about this, because Reagan, his budget and tax proposals were not going anywhere on Capitol Hill. It was a Democratic, the Senate had gone Republican, but the House was still Democratic, and he just wasn't making any headway. And then he stepped outside the Washington Hilton in March of 1981 and was shot by John Hinckley. And he handled it so gracefully, you know. He says to Nancy, "Honey, I forgot to duck," you know. He says to the doctors as they're about to operate on him, "I hope you're Republicans." And, you know, and he just, this was when Reagan really, it was a little bit like Roosevelt had been elected as the anti-Hoover. And it wasn't until he was almost shot and killed 2 weeks before he took office. Franklin Roosevelt was when he went down to Miami, which is a story that I deal with extensively in my book. It wasn't until then that Roosevelt really became popular. First, he was just the alternative to Hoover. And Jimmy Carter was another, you know, engineer like Herbert Hoover, and failed president from the other party. And Reagan was kind of the anti-Carter, and a lot of people voted for him because they didn't like double-digit unemployment, inflation, and interest rates. But he didn't really go into the hearts of the American people until he almost died. And at that point, his legislative program moves through Congress very quickly, and it's extraordinarily important to get off on the right foot because it's very, very hard to recover later. Now, that brings us George H.W. Bush's first 100 days, basically a non-event. That brings us to Bill Clinton. He unfortunately did not have a successful first 100 days, and I think that it hurt him. He recovered better than any other president who stumbled out of the gate. Clinton recovered the best of any president, but he did stumble. And a lot of it was not his fault. He did not want to get bogged down in the gays in the military question. Senator Sam Nunn of Georgia did not do him any favors, to put it mildly. I think Skip remembers this, by fastening on to that gays in the military issue early in the Clinton presidency. It was a major league distraction from the new president trying to develop a productive relationship with Congress. Then the press blew up a silly incident at the Los Angeles airport where President Clinton got his hair cut, and they said that it delayed traffic on the runway, which turned out not to be true, but by the time the truth came out, the damage had already been done, and he looked like he was, you know, he'd gone from when he'd been elected the fall before as you know, just a regular guy from Arkansas. He looked like he'd gone Hollywood. That's not the tone you want to have conveyed when you're a new president. And the press gave him very little honeymoon. The Republicans were already saying that he wasn't a legitimate president because he hadn't gotten 50% of the vote. I don't know where they kind of came up with that, because we've had other presidents with third-party candidates like Ross Perot who haven't been elected with over 50% of the vote. But Tom DeLay and the Republican minority, they went after Clinton in that first 100 days from the get-go, fiercely. And the Democrats were in the majority, but remember, in the House, they had been there since 1952. 54, I guess, 1954. And they were so full of themselves and their own prerogatives and their perks. And some of them had literally been there since 1954, but they'd gotten so accustomed to power that they didn't see their success as being bound up in Bill Clinton's success. And so they were difficult. The Senate was back in Democratic hands for the first time. They wrestled it back from the Republicans in 1986, but it was there wasn't anywhere like Obama's majorities in the Senate. I don't know, maybe somebody here knows how many Democrats Bill Clinton had when he came in. I think it was probably 54, 46, something like that. So he didn't, by that time the 60 vote margin was already pretty firmly established. He didn't have anywhere close to 60 votes. Obama's just one. When Al Franken shows up, Obama will be just one away from having 60 votes. Combination of these things. I think some of the mistakes that Clinton can be assigned are that his transition was kind of chaotic, and actually the Obama people went to school on the Clinton transition, and with the help of a lot of the Clinton folks, tried to not repeat some of the mistakes. He selected his cabinet, or tried to select his cabinet, before picking his White House staff. I remember being in Little Rock shortly before the inauguration, on the day when Mac McClarty was chosen to be Bill Clinton's White House chief of staff. It was at the end of the transition and that the White House staff was named. And you notice that Obama named them at the very beginning of the transition, because you cannot assume the mantle of power and get the machinery working the way it needs to be if you don't have a staff, if you don't have a White House staff. So the Obama people just flipped that. And it wasn't so much Mac McClarty's fault, although it didn't help that he didn't have any Washington experience. It wasn't so much his fault. He was not able to hit the ground running because he was named so late. So that was one big mistake. I'd say another big mistake was they didn't, in the Clinton years, in the first 100 days, they didn't kiss up to us. Now here's the thing. Here's the thing about the press. Now I don't want to offend anybody, but we were talking earlier about how like Rahm Emanuel drops the F-bomb wherever he is, so I'll say it. We're easy lays, okay? Like, if a president kisses up, hi, come on, you know, like in the second week of the Obama administration, I couldn't go because I was skiing with my 15-year-old, and I wasn't going to, you know, interrupt our vacation. But call from the White House. You want to join President Obama on Air Force One? Yeah, sure. If I could, you bet I'd be there. Yeah, yeah. And he did that with quite a number of journalists. And why? Because you do have to court different constituencies. And Bill Clinton later got better at this, again, when he recovered and had some major accomplishments. But early on, he kind of thought that this was pre-internet, but they thought they were going to use direct communications to go over the head of the White House press corps and the old media, and use what even then was called new media, talk radio, other ways of communicating, to kind of cut us out. And there was an article in the New Yorker that Sidney Blumenthal wrote about the White House strategy to kind of do that. That they didn't need us. That was all old thinking, White House press corps. So I was actually, for much of Clinton's first 100 days, I was on a fellowship in Japan, and I was watching it from afar. It wasn't going well. And I got back in June of 1993, and I wrote a column in Newsweek. And the headline of the column was "The Jurassic Park Press." The movie Jurassic Park, the Steven Spielberg movie, had just come out. Remember that, about, you know, the dinosaurs at the theme park come alive and they eat everybody and they crush the person on the toilet, and, you know, it was a huge, huge, huge smash hit. And my point then was, the press might be dinosaurs, the mainstream, old-fashioned press, people like me, we might be dinosaurs, but dinosaurs bite. And it's smart of a president, particularly a new president, to recognize that he wants to deal with all the new media, but also he's got to do some care and feeding of those dinosaurs. And so I think that's, again, something that Obama has learned. President Bush had the second had actually a fairly successful first 100 days. They had Chinese incident with a U.S. military plane that went into Chinese airspace, was forced to land, and that was resolved peacefully. They got through the No Child Left Behind bill either during the 100 days or not too long after, which was a major educational reform. But then this is why having a successful first 100 days is necessary but not sufficient, or helpful but not sufficient, because we know what happened to his presidency. I would argue that it was already doomed by late 2001, even though he was immensely popular for the rest of his the rest of 2002 and into 2003 and the beginning of the Iraq War. I think it was doomed not just because the Iraq War was a fiasco, but because he decided to politicize 9/11. This is something that historians have not really focused on very much, but they will. And in the run-up to the 2002 midterm elections, they ran pictures of people like Max Cleveland, who lost 2 legs in Vietnam and was in the Senate from Georgia, and they ran his picture next to Osama bin Laden's picture, and they were successful in beating him. But you can fool people for a while with that, but at a certain point, people realize that that kind of thing is just wrong, and Karl Rove politics came back to destroy their presidency. Now, in terms of President Obama's first 100 days, and this is what I assume we'll be talking about mostly in our Q&A, if Roosevelt had 15 major bills, I would argue that Obama has put about 10 major bills on the board. He's put a lot of points on the board. The stimulus package, $787 billion. Just to give you an example, President Clinton proposed a stimulus package in 1993. It was a $16 billion stimulus package, and it failed. So we can criticize various elements, as I have, of Obama's stimulus plan. Obviously, it went through mostly because of the state of the economy, but a win is a win. And that was several major pieces of legislation at once. It was the largest investment in infrastructure since the Interstate Highway Act in the 1950s. It was the largest education bill since the one I described by LBJ in the 1960s. It was a huge energy package. It was unprecedented aid to state and local government. He's also had a pay equity for women, expansion of Bill Clinton's S-chip bill, expansion of AmeriCorps. So in some of what he's doing is building on some of the groundwork that President Clinton lay. I wrote a piece last year after the Iowa caucuses that was not popular in Clinton land, where I said that I thought that in many ways Barack Obama was the natural heir to Bill Clinton, and that he would be able to complete the unfinished agenda of Bill Clinton. And I think that we've seen a lot of that already in the first 100 days. And he set a tone of accessibility, ease within himself, an ability to communicate that's been very effective. Most important of all, in the story in the New York Times today about the poll that New York Times CBS poll. Polls come and go, they go up and down. His approval ratings will go down at a certain point, unquestionably. The right track, wrong track numbers that are so favorable for him right now will change. But there's one finding in that poll that if it changes, he's in real trouble, because it's the key to Barack Obama's success. And that's that 2/3 of Americans think that he's not just another politician. And this was something that, unfortunately for Bill Clinton, he never had that, in part because of the particular nature of the '92 campaign, some of the things that came up, some of the obstacles he had to overcome. He was, from a pretty early point, seen as a politician. Well, they're all politicians. Well, Barack Obama's a, cagey politician. But it really helps if you want to have success in office, to have people feel like you're not just feeding them another line, and that you're somehow a little different than the ordinary politician. And that's right now, with the public, the main thing that President Obama has going for him. There are a lot of pitfalls ahead. He could still very easily be swamped by problems. I think his bank rescue plan is flawed and probably won't work, and they'll have to go back to the drawing board. God knows how they're going to get the Congress to give them the money. The next time, there have been so many bailouts already. Reminds me of Republican Senator, a wonderful old guy from my home state, Illinois, Everett Dirksen, used to say, $1 billion here, $1 billion there. Pretty soon, you're talking about real money. And today, it's $1 trillion here, $1 trillion there. Pretty soon, you're talking about real money. And so these deficit issues are huge, but they should be seen as medium and long-term issues, not short-term issues. In the short term, you've got to spend, spend, spend. And that goes for individuals as well as for the government. But over time, we're going to have to rethink entitlements and make a lot of other tough choices that will not be popular. So it may be that, depending in large part on what happens to the economy, you could have a situation that's almost the reverse of President Clinton, who started off slow with problems, lost the Congress in '94, and then, despite scandal, came back to have a successful presidency. It's conceivable that you could see the reverse happening with Obama, where he starts out very strong, gets a lot of things through. I think they're going to get health care through this year, by the end of this year. And there's a lot of indications that that's going to happen. But then when the tough choices set in, and he has to start doing things like cutting benefits, which is inevitable, then his popularity will go down, he'll get less done, and you might have a situation where he has a much more challenging end to his term or end to his 8 years. David Axelrod told me at one point that shortly before the election that Obama didn't care if he was a one-term president, if he got done what he hoped to do, that he wasn't going to govern looking to re-election. To my mind, my reaction to that is, that's what they all say. I'll believe it when I see it, but I do think that there is a chance that he could be a little bit like James K. Polk, who was, by the way, an outstanding president, although not much remembered by history, who never ran for re-election in 1848 because he felt like he'd accomplished everything that he set out to do in 4 years. So that's also conceivable. I'd say unlikely. More likely is that he'll have the same ups and downs as any president, but they're not quite as steep as those experienced by Bill Clinton, because I think people's appetites for these stupid feeding frenzies that we got during the Clinton years has abated. And people don't, in some ways, even the press doesn't want to get distracted. The last point I'll make, a lot of the nonsense of the 90s, the scandal obsession, the obsession with haircuts or whatever the story of the week was a luxury of peace and prosperity. When you have peace and prosperity, the press, the public can obsess about little things. When you are in trouble, people, rightly, are less tolerant of distractions and more focused on the real issues. And that's something, in that sense, while Obama's been dealt a terrible hand, a much worse hand than Clinton was dealt, he has some things going for him that Clinton didn't, in that the American people are not as interested, not that the people were ever that interested in a lot of the nonsense. And that gives him a chance to stay on message. He's got the help of a lot of veterans of the Clinton years, not just as chief of staff, but throughout his government, who have been there before and welcome what some of them think of as a do-over for parts of the Clinton years. So I think with that, I will stand down and take the advice that Franklin Roosevelt gave speakers that I haven't so far. When he was asked, what should you do if you speak? He says, be sincere, be brief, and be seated. So thank you very much.
We've got microphones, so...
I went too long, my apologies.
No, you didn't. It was great. Yeah. I would have stopped you had you gone too long. Let's pass this one up to Annie.
I followed your history carefully, but I think I'd like to think in terms that you also know how it ended. What impact does the leadership style, the personality type, the geographical incubator in which a president comes from, and the strength of his spiritual background and his spouse's intellect?
The question is, what impact does the candidate or the president's background, his faith, his spouse, what impact does this have on a president? And because we were talking about, policy in the 100 days, I didn't get into that today, but I think you've touched on an extraordinarily important part of the success of any president. Today on the plane, I was rereading, because I'm preparing a book about Obama now, I was rereading Dreams from My Father, which I would recommend to everybody in this room that they read. This, more so than The Audacity of Hope, his later book when he had already gone into politics. This was the book he wrote before he went into politics. He was a young lawyer in Chicago, and it tells you so much about Obama and who he is and where he comes from and how he overcame the challenges in his own very unusual background. Michelle Obama is an extraordinarily important part of his success. She was, like Hillary Clinton, she was beaten up by the certain elements in politics early on. I remember, I don't have too many YouTube moments where, something I do gets put on YouTube, but last year I was on one of these MSNBC shows, and there was a right-wing radio talk show host, and he started going on about how Michelle Obama was un-American and, she didn't love her country. And I lit into this guy. I said, do you know Michelle Obama? No, I've never met her. I said, well, I do. I know her, and what you're saying about her is totally untrue. And don't judge people that way who you don't know, And as I was saying it, and afterward, I was thinking we should have done more of that in the Clinton years. People needed to fight back a little more when people's character and their background was being maligned. Now you see some of it still going on about Obama's background on the blogs, on certain blogs that you saw about Clinton. It's different stuff. Oh, he wasn't born in the United States, so he's not really legitimately president. This kind of stuff, not to mention, rank racist stuff. So part of the job of the press is to focus on some of these other issues, to look at to try to explain things about the person's past that might help explain how they got there and why they're successful. And I'm very, very interested in Virginia Kelly, for instance, in trying to understand Bill Clinton. And I believe her book, and I had a conversation once with President Clinton about this, and he was very proud of the help that he gave her on that book, and he was really pleased that I enjoyed that book. You can learn a lot about Bill Clinton by reading Virginia Kelly's book, and I lap up everything I can about Obama's family. You really want to know what was his grandmother like? What was his mother like? We did quite a bit of this kind of reporting in Newsweek last year, and we did a cover story on his mother, who died of cancer some years ago. So that's all important. Obviously, faith is important, and it's a long-winded way of saying you've touched on something that journalists need to be very, very concerned about.
Question right here. Let's see, we have one. Let's go back to the back. Dale Todd has a question, one of our students. Back to back.
Todd Moore, one of the students here at Clinton School. Thanks for coming out. My question's about the state of journalism today. Craigslist has kind of decimated newspapers, and bloggers have really taken a market share away from periodicals like weeklies and monthlies like Newsweek. Can you comment a little bit about what the future holds for a magazine like Newsweek or for an op-ed columnist like yourself?
That's a kind of a sad question. Well, we're relaunching Newsweek in about a month with a totally new design. We've had very, very sharp cutbacks in a lot of our staffing levels, but the new magazine is going to be a little more highbrow is not the right word, but not aimed at everybody, aimed at you, basically, people in this room who are already somewhat interested. We're not going to really. We're cutting our circulation. It's very expensive to maintain a circulation of over 3 million, which is what we had before. So we're cutting it down below 2 million to put us on a better footing. We think our future is good, but we are at risk, like all dead tree media is at risk. My own feeling is as long as baby boomers are alive, and we're going to be around, I hope, for, another few decades, that there's going to be a role for magazines and newspapers, but it'll be a diminished and different role. The same way television didn't kill radio, it just took a different form. Usually older forms of media don't die, they just kind of mutate. But the basic economic problem is that we made a terrible mistake in the 90s when we didn't start charging for content on the web. Our website is very vital, and it's very successful. We have a lot of unique visits, as do other mainstream media websites. Problem is we only have one revenue stream, and that's from advertising. We don't have any circulation stream. We don't charge for content, and we started giving it away for free. And now everybody expects to get it for free. So we somehow have to get that toothpaste back in the tube. There's a lot of conversation about doing that now. The record business managed to do it with Apple Store. Remember Napster? And everybody was getting all their music for free, and then Steve Jobs did figure out a way to get people to pay for music. Whether that will apply to journalism, I don't know. But the basic problem is, to just encapsulate the basic business problem, talk is cheap and reporting is expensive. It's real cheap for a blogger to sit home in his PJs and do a blog on what he thinks about what he read in the New York Times that day. It's real expensive to have a bureau in Baghdad. And so the question becomes, who's going to gather the news instead of just chewing over the news, which is what most bloggers, as good as many of them are doing. And they're taking what reporters dig up and they're chewing it over. Now, in terms of op-ed type stuff like mine, we're going to have a lot of that in the new Newsweek. So for right now, I'm doing okay. But when people are writing for free, writing their column for free on Huffington Post, it kind of takes the market value of what I do, down a few notches if there are other people who are doing it for free. Michael Kinsley, a great columnist and a mentor of mine, he said, when you go into a restaurant, you don't want the food cooked by the person who's sitting at the next table. You kind of hope it's like the chef in the kitchen who's cooking your meals. And I feel a little bit like that about some of these sites and blogs where, anybody can be a journalist now. It used to be A.J. Liebling, the great press critic for The New Yorker, said freedom of the press belongs to anyone who owns one. It was like only for big shots, right, until the internet. Now freedom of the press belongs to anybody with a computer. So anybody, but is it good? How much of it is good and how much of it is really pretty worthless? And, do people want to leave at least some of it to the professionals or to spend more time with the professional, what's produced by the professionals? And there's some evidence that the answer to that question is yes. Most of those blogs that you see have about like 4 visitors, and it's the old media that still has the websites that get the heavy traffic. But we need to find out ways to commoditize that. Otherwise, we're not going to be in business.
We got time for one more question.
I'm
Sylvia,
sorry.
right here.
Can I answer, Skip? Can I answer these last three real fast,
Yeah.
so that I'm real crisp?
All right.
Because I want to give some more people a
Okay,
chance.
we got it.
Well, first of all, as a former newspaper person, newspapers and television stations started digging their own graves 20 years ago when they started saying, for the rest of the story, go to the internet and look at our website.
Yeah, right. That's crazy.
With the lack of bipartisanship, which was one of Obama's big selling points in Washington, is it Obama's fault? Is it that the Republicans have just decided that they're not going to allow bipartisanship because they want to hit him over the head with, you haven't delivered on the bipartisanship that you promised? And is the American public blaming Obama or the Republicans?
The American public is, the question is about bipartisanship. I don't think it is Obama's fault. He invited them over for Christmas parties. And, somebody, and this Super Bowl, and all kinds of things. And he's kept it up. He has them over there all the time because he realizes that he wants to keep extending the hand. Somebody from the Bush administration said he's had more Republicans to the White House than Bush did. So he's trying, but he's being rebuffed. Why? And by the way, the Republicans are being blamed because they figure if they go along with him, they won't get any credit. He and the Democrats will get the credit. And if they stand up to him and things go south, then they can say, I told you so, this guy was no good. So politically for them, the percentage is in, they think, the percentage is in being the no party. I think they're wrong, and they're turning themselves into a less well-educated white regional party. Now here in Arkansas, where they did extraordinarily well, I think you maybe get a little bit of a distorted view. The rest of the country, honestly, they've moved on from where Arkansas is. They're just not there anymore. And so, Arkansas can decide they either want to be, and Tennessee faces this too. That doesn't mean they have to turn into an out-and-out blue state, but they need to rebuild the Republican Party. I'm a huge believer in two parties, two strong parties, along something affirmative. It can't just be, we don't like this guy for whatever reason. We don't like him. That's not good enough. So I think they need to be developing their own policy proposals, like maybe getting rid of the payroll tax. Something really, I'm for that. It's a real conservative idea. Something that gives people something to think about. Payroll tax just taxes labor and it's very regressive, and it would allow the Republicans to be for cutting taxes and for doing something that needs to be done. Maybe it's another idea, but they need some ideas or they're not going to get back in the game. And they don't have anybody right now for 2008. Let me quickly take real fast two more questions.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I was wondering just how significant is the fact that Senator Arlen Specter has decided to change parties?
That was this morning. See, I was on the plane on the way
I
down here.
I heard it too, just this morning. Yeah, you just
Well, I
scooped
think
the
it's,
newspaper.
yeah, you just scooped me. I would say my BlackBerry must not be functioning too well, or I didn't get that. I'm sure it's on there. I just haven't looked at it. When did that come across the wires? This morning. Oh, okay. I was on the plane. I was in the Charlotte airport. I think it's very significant, very, very significant, and it's very smart of him to do. That state has turned blue. He was in danger of losing his seat to Pat Toomey in the Republican primary. He will continue to be somebody that the White House would have to court. He'll be like a conservative Democrat who they won't be able to take for granted, but they'll need. He would still provide that 60th vote, but he's a wily guy, and it was a stroke of genius on his part. And I think it'll probably, the problem that he might have is that voters don't like party jumpers generally, if history's any indication. And so it's conceivable that he could lose in a Democratic primary, because a lot of the Democrats, he would need a lot of crossover support to win a Democratic primary, or is he going to run as an independent? He's going to run as a Democrat. I think he's going to have a challenging but not impossible time winning Democratic primary. Part of it depends on who the other Democratic candidates are. But you know, were he to win that primary, he would have an easy general election victory. Whereas staying a Republican, he was going to have a hard time both times. He was going to have a hard time with Pat Toomey in the Republican primary. He was probably going to have to run way to the right to win that Republican primary in Pennsylvania, and then he would still have been in trouble in a general election. In this case, he just has to win the primary and he's home free.
Okay, we have a question right here. Let's get the microphone.
Thank you. Do you think the Democrats in Congress have the leadership necessary to push hard things through? It doesn't seem that they can muster the votes and just do what they want to do, even though they have these big majorities.
Well, you know, it's about the Democrats in the Congress. They've put a lot of points on the board. I mean, I didn't even talk about a lot of the other things that they've gotten done. They've really, they've had a bill signing almost every week. Now, the question is how far? You know, the Senate in particular, you know, the founder said that was the saucer that cooled the you know, the cup that came over from the House. It's supposed to be a cooling mechanism. And if you look at Roosevelt, he didn't get it all through at once. I mean, when Social Security went through, liberals were really mad because it was so watered down at first, and it didn't allow all kinds of categories of beneficiaries, and the benefits were really low. And yet, but you get your nose under the tent, and then you can expand on it. And that's what Bill Clinton did on health care. Remember, after they lost in '94, then they went to a kind of an incremental strategy that works better with Capitol Hill. You do S-chip, then you expand S-chip, then Obama expands it again. Same thing on welfare reform. You know, he had to swallow something he didn't really like on welfare reform. He vowed to go back and change it on food stamps and immigration portions of welfare reform. And he did. So you can't always expect, just because you have a majority, in that case Clinton didn't have a majority, but even if you do, you can't expect to get everything you want. And if you try to ram it through too fast, you create bad feelings, which is one of the questions they have now by using this budget reconciliation process for health care. But we're going to find out this fall whether Obama has steel in his spine. And so what I'm starting to look at is, what will he really fight for? We know he's not going to fight for things like the assault weapons ban, reinstituting that. He's not going to fight for getting rid of price supports for wealthy farmers. You know, he sees those as distractions. Okay, it's a reasonable argument. But we know health care is not a distraction. So will he fight for a public option? Hugely important. Will he fight for true portability, so you're not left high and dry if you lose your health insurance? What is his bottom line going to be where he will stand firm? And that's one of the big unanswered questions. That's why I can't really grade the guy yet. He's got an incomplete, you know, and we're going to have to see. But you've raised a good one. Generally speaking, Reid and Pelosi have been more cooperative than they've been given credit for.
Let's give Jonathan Alter a big
Thank you very much.